War is changing. In Gaza, artificial intelligence helps Israeli warplanes select which neighborhoods to bomb next. In the US, robot dogs and drones help stop the desperate from crossing the southern border. But the biggest change of all is the one least talked about: the privatization of war. In Ukraine, at least 20,000 foreign mercenaries from 50 nations are said to have joined the fight against Russia. And it's not just Ukraine. From Yemen to Sudan, Syria to Nigeria, tens of thousands of guns for hire now fight on behalf of foreign powers. A hidden global war that gets little media attention, but one with profound implications. There's a forgotten story that helps explain how we got here. It begins with a swamp, an inheritance, and a timely war. Ingredients for what would become the largest privatization drive in military history. This is the story of Blackwater and the rise of the secret mercenary armies that have pushed warfare into the shadows. In 1997, a far-right former US Navy SEAL called Eric Prince, the scion of a family of industrialists and religious extremists from Michigan, brought a radical idea to life. In a vast swamp on the Virginia-North Carolina border, he funded the most advanced private training ground for military, security, and police forces anywhere in the country and the world. The business could not have arrived at a better time. Just 4 years later, George W. Bush entered the White House. Under the guidance of neoconservative ideologues like Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld and Vice President Dick Cheney, the Bush government embarked on the most radical program of military privatization in history. The US, Rumsfeld said in a 2001 speech at the Pentagon, faces an adversary that's, quote,
one of the world's last bastions of central planning.
It governs by dictating 5-year plans.
With brutal consistency, it stifles free thought
and crushes new ideas. His tirade was directed not at the remains of the socialist bloc, but at the Pentagon itself. The military, Rumsfeld said, would have to start behaving like venture capitalists. A day later, American Airlines Flight 77 smashed into the western wall of the Pentagon. When the US launched its war of aggression against Iraq in 2003, Eric Prince's new venture, then called Blackwater, was quick to take advantage of the US's radical new privatization agenda. Blackwater soon won its first $27 million no-bid contract to provide security for Ambassador Paul Bremer, who headed the so-called Coalition Provision Authority, the US's colonial administration in Iraq. By 2007, it had won $1 billion in contracts from the State Department alone. More than half of these contracts were awarded without competition or tender. In just a few years, the secretive institution emerged from its swamp to become one of the most important players in the so-called War on Terror. This was a marriage of convenience. Private companies are not required to report deaths and injuries among their mercenary forces. And they even enjoy greater impunity than the lawless US military itself. On September 16, 2007, the world witnessed that impunity. At around noon, a Blackwater convoy of 4 armed vehicles arrived at Baghdad's Nisar Square. Soon, the mercenaries opened fire on unarmed civilians passing through the square in their cars. Panicked, the Iraqi drivers began to flee the scene, but the mercenaries shot at the fleeing cars. In all, 17 civilians were murdered, and more than 20 were injured in what some have called Baghdad's Bloody Sunday. The Iraqi government called the attack an act of deliberate murder, but Blackwater insisted that it acted in self-defense. The State Department backed them up. Not long after the massacre, Eric Prince testified to Congress. Remarkably, not a single question was asked about Nisar Square. But the question of civilian fatalities, which were well documented, did come up. Prince's strategy? Denial.
The people we employ are former U.S. military law enforcement people that have sworn the oath to support and defend the Constitution against all enemies, foreign and domestic.
Then added,
They bleed red, white, and blue.
After the Nisar massacre, Prince's ambitions grew further still. he announced that Blackwater would now become a full-spectrum initiative and began to bid for new Pentagon contracts. In the years that followed, Blackwater established a new mercenary operation staffed by soldiers from all around the world, an intelligence agency staffed by former CIA operatives, an aviation division with dozens of aircraft, and even a line of armored personnel carriers. When the US flew suspected terrorists around the world to so-called black sites, Blackwater's flight records matched those of known torture camps, suggesting that it played a role in the kidnap and torture program. Blackwater came to recruit mercenaries throughout Latin America, often recruiting former fascist foot soldiers who themselves took part in campaigns of torture and massacre. But it didn't stop there. Blackwater came to recruit mercenaries from around the world at a scale that may never be known. In 2016, some 200 Sudanese mercenaries working for Blackwater were killed in a single strike in Yemen. All along, Blackwater moved further and further into the shadows. During the US's wars in West Asia, private equity firms began to invest in private military companies. War is a safe bet. Endless war means endless profit. So these investment firms went on a buying spree that's not only continued to this day, it has accelerated. According to research by the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, private equity firms were responsible for 42% of all takeovers in the US private defense sector in 2019. These funds face no requirement to disclose the financial status of their purchases. Through them, entire armies disappear into black holes where their size or activities can no longer be traced. Meanwhile, the profits continue to pile up. In 2023, Joe Biden requested $842 billion for the US military budget, which is roughly 3 times more than China's military budget and 10 times higher than Russia's. Based on figures in previous years, over half of that money is likely to have gone to private contractors. Blackwater, which is now rebranded as Constellus Holdings, is among them. The new company brings together a range of private mercenary companies with other dull names like Triple Canopy, Tidewater Global Services, National Strategic Protective Solutions, and International Development Solutions. All are owned by Apollo Global Management, Inc., a private equity giant based in New York City, which bought Constellus in 2016. From the tunnels of Gaza to the streets of Raqqa, we often hear whispers of mercenaries fighting on behalf of the US. But how many wars are these private armies really involved in? How large will these corporations become in the future? What's their political reach? Who decides where they fight, and when, and against whom? Blackwater's legacy means that the answers to these questions may long remain hidden. War has been pushed into the shadows. Accountability has been eroded so deeply that the US can deny its active involvement in several wars of its own making. In many ways, we knew where we were headed. In 1961, US President Dwight D. Eisenhower issued an ominous warning in his farewell address about the grave implications of the untrammeled growth of the military-industrial complex. Quote,
"The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist. We must never let the weight of this combination endanger our liberties or democratic processes. We should take nothing for granted. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals, so that security and liberty may prosper together."
This misplaced power has now grown beyond all reasonable proportions. It won't rein itself in. The question is, who will?